My husband claimed my PTSD from sexual assault was unforgiveness, until I found evidence he'd been messaging my attacker on Facebook. I woke up at 3:17 in the morning, drenched in sweat with my husband Nathan's hand on my shoulder and his voice saying my name like he'd been trying to wake me for a while. The nightmare had been the same one I'd had 3 times that week, the one where I was back in that apartment 7 years ago, with Derek's weight pinning me down and my voice not working no matter how hard I tried to scream. Nathan was sitting up in bed looking frustrated rather than concerned, and before I could fully orient myself to being awake and safe in our bedroom, he said, "You need to deal with this, Vanessa. You can't keep letting something from 7 years ago control your life like this." I pulled away from his touch and wrapped my arms around my knees, my heart still hammering from the dream, and told him I was seeing my therapist next week and working on it. He sighed in that particular way he'd developed over the past year, the one that made me feel like I was a problem he was tired of solving, and said, "Maybe what you really need is to forgive Derek and move on. Holding on to unforgiveness is what's keeping you trapped." The word unforgiveness hit me like a slap, because Nathan knew exactly what had happened to me, and he was reducing my trauma to a spiritual failing. I'd been assaulted by Derek Paulson when I was 23, a guy I'd gone on 3 dates with who'd seemed nice until the night he decided my no didn't matter. I'd reported it to the police and endured the humiliating process of a rape kit and police interviews, only to have the case dropped because the prosecutor said it was he said, she said, and Derek had text messages showing we'd been dating. The texts proved nothing about consent that night, but apparently they were enough to make my assault unprosecutable. I'd spent years in therapy learning to function again, to trust people again, to not flinch when someone touched me unexpectedly. Nathan had known all of this when we started dating 4 years ago. He'd been patient and understanding then, or at least I'd thought he was. Lately, though, his patience had turned into something that looked more like contempt. I got out of bed without responding to his comment about forgiveness, and went to the bathroom where I splashed cold water on my face and stared at myself in the mirror. I was 30 years old, a data analyst for a healthcare company, married for 2 years to a man who increasingly made me feel like my trauma was an inconvenience to him. The nightmares had gotten worse over the past few months, triggered by news stories about sexual assault cases and the upcoming anniversary of my attack. My therapist, Dr. Lisa Chen, had explained that anniversaries often intensified PTSD symptoms, and we were working through it with EMDR therapy and coping strategies. But Nathan had started treating my therapy appointments like a waste of time and money, suggesting instead that I just needed to let go and let God handle my pain. He'd been raised in a conservative evangelical church and had been pulling me deeper into that world since we got married, attending services 3 times a week and joining small groups where everyone's problems got solved with Bible verses and prayer. When I came back to bed, Nathan was already asleep or pretending to be, turned away from me with his breathing steady and even. I lay there in the dark thinking about how he used to hold me after nightmares, how he used to tell me it wasn't my fault and he was there for me. That version of Nathan felt like someone I'd imagined rather than someone who'd actually existed. I picked up my phone from the nightstand and opened Instagram mindlessly, scrolling through pictures of friends' vacations and babies and carefully curated happy moments. Then I switched to Facebook, even though I rarely used it anymore, just something to occupy my racing mind. I was about to close the app when I noticed Nathan had left his Facebook open on my phone from earlier that day when his phone had died and he'd borrowed mine to check something. I should have logged him out and gone to my own account, but something made me pause. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that looking through his messages would make me the kind of wife I didn't want to be. But my thumb was already moving to his messenger icon before I'd consciously decided to look. His recent conversations were mostly with his brother and his coworkers. Nothing interesting or suspicious. I was about to close it feeling guilty for even looking when I saw a name in his message list that made my blood run cold. Derek Paulson. The messages were from 3 weeks ago, and my hands started shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. I clicked on the conversation and started reading, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Nathan had initiated the contact, sending Derek a message that said, "Hey man, I know this is random, but I'm married to Vanessa now and I wanted to reach out. I've been trying to help her move past what happened between you two, but she's really stuck. Thought maybe hearing your side of things might give me some insight into how to help her let go of the anger." Derek's response came the next day. A long paragraph about how he'd always felt bad about the misunderstanding between them, how he'd thought they were on the same page that night and was shocked when she reported it as assault. He said he'd been in therapy too, dealing with the trauma of being falsely accused, that his reputation had been damaged and relationships had suffered because of her version of events. He told Nathan he appreciated him reaching out and was glad Vanessa had found someone who could see past her need to play the victim. The casual way he referred to my rape as a misunderstanding and an accusation, rather than what he'd actually done to me, made nausea rise in my throat. I kept reading through the messages, watching my husband validate my rapist's narrative and commiserate with him about how difficult I was being by not moving on. Nathan had told Derek that I was in therapy and on medication for PTSD, sharing my private medical information with the man who'd caused that PTSD in the first place. In one message, Nathan had written, "I love my wife, but honestly this whole thing is affecting our marriage. She has nightmares constantly, and sometimes she flinches when I touch her, and it makes me feel like she sees me as a threat." I'm trying to be patient, but it's been 7 years, and at some point she has to take responsibility for her own healing instead of blaming you for everything wrong in her life." Derek had responded with sympathy and understanding, saying he knew exactly what Nathan meant, and it must be hard being married to someone so damaged. He'd offered to meet up with Nathan sometime to talk more. Said maybe if they could present a united front of men who cared about her, it might help me see that I was sabotaging my own happiness by holding on to the past. Nathan had agreed that was a good idea, and they'd exchanged phone numbers. The last message in the thread was from 5 days ago, Nathan telling Derek he'd call him soon to set something up. I sat there in the dark bedroom holding my phone and trying to process what I'd just read. My husband, the man who'd promised to love and protect me, had been secretly communicating with my rapist. He'd shared intimate details about my mental health and our marriage with the person who'd violated me. He'd validated Derek's version of events where I was a vindictive liar who'd ruined his life with false accusations. He'd discussed strategies for manipulating me into forgiving Derek and moving on. Every molecule of trust I'd had in Nathan disintegrated in the space between one breath and the next. I wanted to wake him up and scream at him, to demand an explanation for this betrayal, but I also knew that confronting him right now in the middle of the night while I was this emotional would give him the upper hand. He'd make it about my reaction rather than his actions. He'd say I was being irrational and oversensitive, that I was letting my trauma make me paranoid and unstable. Instead, I got out of bed as quietly as possible and took my phone to the guest bedroom down the hall. I locked the door and sat on the bed, then opened Nathan's Facebook Messenger again, and took screenshots of every single message between him and Derek. I sent the screenshots to my own email address and then to my best friend Adrienne's email with a message saying, "Need to talk ASAP, emergency, please don't call, just email back when you see this." Then I deleted the sent messages from Nathan's Facebook account so he wouldn't know I'd found them yet. I needed time to think and plan before he knew I was aware of what he'd been doing. My mind was racing through implications and possibilities, trying to understand how the man I'd married could have done something this cruel. Had he always been like this and I'd missed the signs? Or had something changed in him over the past 2 years? I thought back through our relationship looking for red flags I'd ignored. We'd met at a coffee shop where we'd both been working on our laptops, and he'd struck up a conversation about the book I was reading. He'd been charming and interested in me, asking questions, and actually listening to the answers. On our third date, I told him about the assault because I'd learned that being upfront about my trauma was better than trying to hide it and having someone discover it later. Nathan had been understanding and gentle, telling me he was sorry that had happened to me, and he'd never pressure me or make me uncomfortable. In the early months of our relationship, he'd been patient when I had panic attacks or needed to slow down physically. He'd supported my therapy and asked how he could help. But after we got engaged, things had started shifting. He'd become more involved in his church and started suggesting I come with him more often. The church preached a lot about biblical marriage roles and wifely submission and forgiveness as the solution to all problems. After our wedding, Nathan had gradually become more controlling about how I spent my time and money, more critical of my choices, more dismissive of my feelings. He'd started framing everything in terms of spiritual warfare and godly principles, telling me that my struggles were because I hadn't fully surrendered to God's plan for my life. When I'd told him that his church's teachings about submission made me uncomfortable, he'd said I was being rebellious and letting feminism poison my mind against biblical truth. When I'd suggested we needed marriage counseling, he'd said secular therapy would just validate my victim mentality instead of helping me take responsibility for my choices. I'd started to feel like I was losing myself in the marriage, like I was being slowly erased and replaced with whoever Nathan thought I should be, but I'd told myself that all marriages required compromise and adjustment, that I was probably being too sensitive, that the love and support he'd shown me early on was still there underneath the religious rhetoric. Now, sitting in the guest bedroom at almost 4 a.m, looking at screenshots of my husband bonding with my rapist, I realized I hadn't been too sensitive at all. I'd been married to someone who'd never actually believed me about the assault. Someone who thought Derek's version of events was equally valid, if not more credible. Someone who saw my PTSD not as a legitimate medical condition resulting from trauma, but as a character flaw I was using to manipulate sympathy and avoid responsibility. The betrayal felt worse than the assault in some ways because I'd chosen Nathan. I'd trusted him with the most vulnerable parts of myself, and he'd taken that vulnerability and weaponized it against me. Derek had shown me who he was in one terrible night. Nathan had spent 4 years pretending to be someone else before revealing his true character. I didn't know which violation cut deeper. My phone buzzed with an email from Adrienne sent from her work address, which meant she'd already gotten to her office on the East Coast where it was almost 7 a.m. Her message said, "I'm at my desk, call me right now." I dialed her number and she answered on the first ring, her voice tight with concern. "What happened? Your email scared me." I told her everything as quietly as I could, trying not to cry because I didn't want Nathan to hear me if he woke up. Adrienne had been my friend since college and had been there through the immediate aftermath of the assault. She'd believed me without question and had helped me navigate the police investigation and the crushing disappointment when the case was dropped. She'd also been skeptical about Nathan from the beginning, though she'd tried to be supportive when I'd gotten serious with him. I knew something was off about him. she said when I finished explaining. I knew it. The way he talked about your trauma always felt performative to me, like he was saying the right things, but didn't actually feel them. So, Adrian told me I needed to get out of the house immediately, that I should pack a bag and come stay with her in New York until I figured out my next steps. I told her I couldn't just leave without a plan, that Nathan and I had a joint lease and shared bank accounts and a whole life I couldn't just abandon. She said that life was already over the moment Nathan had sent that first message to Derek. I just hadn't known it yet. She was right, but the logistics of untangling a marriage felt overwhelming when I could barely process the emotional weight of what I'd discovered. Adrian shifted tactics and said, "Okay, fine. Stay for now, but document everything. Screenshot those messages again, print them out, save them in multiple places. Check your bank accounts and credit cards. Look through his email and phone if you can. Gather evidence of everything before you confront him because men like Nathan will lie and gaslight you and make you doubt your own memory of events. You need proof you can hold on to when he tries to manipulate you." We talked for almost an hour, with Adrian helping me think through practical steps while also letting me process the emotional devastation. By the time we hung up, the sun was starting to rise and I could hear Nathan moving around in our bedroom. I splashed water on my face in the guest bathroom and tried to compose myself before going back to face him. When I walked into our bedroom, he was getting dressed for work, pulling on the dress shirt and slacks he wore to his job as an insurance claims adjuster. He looked at me and said, "You slept in the guest room?" I told him I'd had another nightmare and didn't want to keep waking him up. He accepted this without much interest, already focused on his phone and his morning routine. I watched him move around the room gathering his things, and he looked like a stranger to me. This man who I'd promised to spend my life with, who I'd believed loved and protected me, was secretly collaborating with my rapist to convince me I was the problem. Nathan left for work at his usual time after kissing me on the forehead in a distracted way that made my skin crawl. As soon as his car pulled out of the driveway, I went back to his Facebook messages and took more screenshots, this time including Derek's profile information and any mutual friends they had. Then I opened Nathan's email on my laptop since we shared a computer and he'd never bothered to log out. I searched for Derek's name and found nothing, which meant Nathan had been smart enough to keep their communication limited to Facebook. But I did find emails to his pastor about me. Messages where Nathan had described my PTSD symptoms as spiritual bondage and asked for advice on how to lead me to freedom through submission to godly authority. The pastor, a man named Keith Drummond, who I'd met several times at church events, had written back with suggestions about increasing prayer and Bible study, about having me meet with the women's ministry leader to discuss biblical womanhood, about limiting my contact with secular influences like my therapist. I took screenshots of those emails too, building a file of evidence that showed Nathan's betrayal wasn't just about Derek. It was a pattern of dismissing my trauma, sharing my private information without consent, and actively working to undermine my healing process because it didn't fit his religious framework. I checked our joint bank account and found several charges to restaurants I didn't recognize, dates stamped from times when Nathan had told me he was working late. I couldn't prove who he'd been with, but the pattern was suspicious. I checked his phone records through our shared account and found numerous calls to a number I didn't recognize over the past month. I reverse searched the number and discovered it belonged to Derek Paulson. They'd been talking on the phone, not just messaging. Nathan had been actively maintaining a relationship with my rapist behind my back, and I had no idea what they'd discussed in those conversations. The violation of trust was so complete that I felt physically ill. I went to the bathroom and threw up, then sat on the cold tile floor trying to breathe through the panic attack that was building in my chest. All the coping strategies my therapist had taught me felt useless against this level of betrayal. I'd spent years healing from what Derek had done to me, building my life back piece by piece, and now I had to process that my husband had been undermining that healing the entire time, that he'd been talking to Derek for weeks, sharing intimate details about me, conspiring about how to manipulate me into forgiving my rapist. I thought about all the times Nathan had pressured me to attend church events where people talked about forgiveness as if it were a simple choice rather than a complex process. All the times he'd suggested my nightmares were my own fault for not releasing the past. All the times he'd made me feel guilty for still struggling with PTSD 7 years after the assault. Every single one of those moments had been part of a coordinated effort to break down my boundaries and make me complicit in my own revictimization. I called my therapist's office and begged the receptionist to give me an emergency session. Dr. Chen had an opening that afternoon at 3, and I took it immediately. Then I called my boss and told her I needed to work from home for the rest of the week due to a family emergency. She was understanding and told me to take care of myself. I spent the rest of the morning documenting everything I could find, printing out bank statements and phone records and emails, creating a physical file I could take with me if I needed to leave suddenly. I also called a divorce attorney whose name Adrian had sent me, a woman named Stephanie Roth who specialized in high-conflict divorces. Her paralegal said she could see me on Friday afternoon, 3 days away. I made the appointment and felt something shift in my chest, a sense of forward momentum that helped cut through the paralysis of shock. I was taking action. I was protecting myself. I wasn't going to let Nathan or Derek or anyone else make me doubt my reality ever again. At my therapy session that afternoon, Dr. Chen listened to everything with the calm, professional demeanor she always maintained, but I could see anger flashing in her eyes when I described Nathan's messages with Derek. When I finished, she said, "Vanessa, what Nathan has done is not just a betrayal of trust. It's a form of abuse called intimate partner violence, specifically psychological and emotional abuse. He's been undermining your sense of reality, isolating you from support systems, and allying with your abuser. This is extremely serious, and I'm concerned for your safety." I hadn't thought about safety being an issue because Nathan had never been physically violent, but Dr. Chen explained that men who engaged in this level of manipulation and boundary violation could escalate in unpredictable ways when confronted. She asked if I had somewhere safe to go if I needed to leave the house quickly, and I told her about Adrienne's offer to stay with her in New York. Dr. Chen said I should consider taking Adrienne up on that offer sooner rather than later. She also said something that hit me hard. "You've been in therapy with me for 3 years working on healing from sexual trauma. During that time, your husband has been actively working against your healing by maintaining a relationship with your rapist and trying to convince you that your symptoms are your fault. That means you've essentially been trying to recover while still in an abusive environment. The fact that you've made any progress at all is remarkable, but you deserve to heal in a space where your trauma is taken seriously and your reality is validated." I started crying because hearing it stated so clearly made me realize how much Nathan had stolen from me. Not just trust and safety, but actual years of my life where I could have been healing faster and more completely if he hadn't been sabotaging me. Dr. Chen gave me the number for a domestic violence hotline and made me promise to call if I felt unsafe at any point. Then she helped me develop a safety plan for how to handle the next few days before I could meet with the attorney. I went home and Nathan arrived shortly after me, walking in with takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant, like this was a normal evening. He asked about my day and I gave vague answers while we ate dinner, both of us pretending everything was fine. I kept thinking about how easy he found this deception, how naturally the lies came to him. After dinner, Nathan suggested we watch something on Netflix, and we sat on the couch with him scrolling through options while I sat stiffly beside him trying not to scream. He landed on some action movie and started it, then reached over to hold my hand. His touch made my skin crawl, but I didn't pull away because I didn't want to alert him that something had changed. We sat there for 2 hours watching explosions and car chases while I planned my exit strategy, and he remained oblivious to the bomb about to go off in his own life. When the movie ended, Nathan turned to me and said, "I'm sorry about what I said last night about forgiveness. I know you're working on healing in your own way, and I should be more supportive." The apology was so perfectly timed and worded that I wondered if he'd been planning it all day, if this was part of his strategy to manage me. I told him I appreciated that and we should both get some rest. In bed, he fell asleep quickly while I lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about the phone calls between him and Derek. What had they discussed? Had they laughed about me together? Had Nathan shared details about our sex life or lack thereof when my PTSD symptoms were particularly bad? Had Derek given Nathan advice on how to manipulate me more effectively? The questions spiraled endlessly, and I knew I wouldn't get answers unless I confronted Nathan directly. But I needed to wait until after I met with the attorney and had a clear plan for what came next. I couldn't risk confronting him prematurely and having him cover his tracks or escalate his behavior. Dr. Chen's warning about safety kept echoing in my mind, and I realized I didn't actually know what Nathan was capable of when cornered. The next 2 days passed in a surreal haze where I went through the motions of normal life while secretly preparing to blow everything up. I transferred money from our joint account into my personal account, taking half of what was there and leaving the rest. I gathered important documents like my birth certificate and social security card and our marriage license. I packed a bag with clothes and essentials and hid it in my car trunk. I contacted my landlord to ask about options for breaking our lease early. Every action felt like I was dismantling my life piece by piece, but I knew I was actually building a new foundation for something healthier. Nathan seemed to sense nothing unusual, chatting about his work and his church small group and normal mundane things, while completely unaware that I'd discovered his secret relationship with Derek. The cognitive dissonance of watching him perform the role of caring husband while knowing what he'd done was almost unbearable. Friday afternoon, I met with Stephanie Roth at her law office in a building downtown. She was a woman in her mid-50s with gray hair and sharp eyes that assessed me quickly when I walked in. I'd brought all my documentation with me. The screenshots of Nathan's messages with Derek, the emails to his pastor, the phone records, the bank statements. I laid everything out on her desk and told her the whole story from the assault 7 years ago through discovering the messages 4 days ago. Stephanie listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When I finished, she said, "This is one of the most egregious cases of marital betrayal I've seen in 20 years of practice. Your husband has not only violated your trust, but has potentially opened himself up to civil liability, depending on what information he shared with Derek and whether Derek used that information in any way to harm you further." Stephanie explained that in our state, I could file for divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty based on Nathan's emotional abuse and betrayal. She said the Facebook messages and emails would be powerful evidence if Nathan tried to contest the divorce or fight for any assets. She also said I should consider filing a police report about Nathan sharing my private medical information with Derek. though she cautioned that criminal charges were unlikely to stick unless we could prove Derek had used the information to harass or threaten me. But having a police report on file would create an official record of Nathan's behavior that could be useful if he tried to retaliate or if Derek escalated his contact. Stephanie asked if I wanted to pursue a protective order against either Nathan or Derek, and I said I wasn't sure yet. She told me to think about it seriously, that men who'd been caught doing something this manipulative often reacted unpredictably when confronted. She'd seen too many situations escalate into violence to take any chances. We spent the next hour going over the practical details of filing for divorce. Stephanie said she could have papers drawn up by Monday, and we could serve Nathan by the end of next week. She recommended I not tell him about the divorce until after he'd been served, so he couldn't try to drain bank accounts or hide assets or engage in any other retaliatory behavior. I told her about my plan to stay with Adrian in New York, and she said that was smart, but I should wait until after Nathan was served to leave town, so it didn't look like I was abandoning our marital home. She said if I left first, Nathan could potentially argue that I'd deserted him, which might affect asset division. The legal strategy was cold and practical, and I was grateful for Stephanie's experience guiding me through decisions I had no framework for making. By the time I left her office, I had a timeline. Papers would be drafted over the weekend. I'd review and sign them Monday. Nathan would be served Thursday, and I'd leave for Adrian's place that same day. That night, Nathan came home from church small group talking about the sermon on forgiveness and how the pastor had made such good points about releasing bitterness. I listened to him summarize the sermon while internally screaming, wondering if he had any self-awareness at all about the hypocrisy of preaching forgiveness while secretly betraying me. After he went to bed, I stayed up late in the living room and did something I'd been avoiding. I looked at Derek Paulson's Facebook profile. His privacy settings were tight, so I couldn't see much, but his profile picture showed him smiling at some outdoor event, looking normal and harmless. Like any guy you'd pass on the street without a second thought. Not like someone who'd raped me and then spent years claiming I'd falsely accused him. His banner photo showed him with a woman, both of them holding drinks and laughing. I wondered if she knew what he'd done to me. I wondered if Nathan had told Derek about her, the way Derek had told Nathan about me. The idea of these two men bonding over their respective women's damage made me want to set something on fire. I clicked over to Derek's friends list and started scrolling through names. About 24 people down, I found Nathan listed as a friend. They'd been Facebook friends for at least 3 weeks based on the messages, which meant Nathan had sent Derek a friend request as part of initiating contact. The premeditation of it made everything worse. This wasn't a chance encounter or a momentary lapse in judgment. Nathan had actively sought out my rapist, added him on social media, and cultivated a relationship with him over weeks and phone calls. I wanted to understand why. What did Nathan think he was going to gain from this? Did he genuinely believe Derek's version of events and think he was helping me by getting both sides of the story? Or did he know exactly what Derek had done and just didn't care because maintaining his narrative about forgiveness was more important than my actual healing? The weekend dragged by with excruciating slowness. Nathan wanted to go to church on Sunday, and I made an excuse about having a migraine, staying home alone while he went to services. I used the time to go through more of his things, searching for any additional evidence I hadn't found yet. In the back of his desk drawer, I found a journal where he'd been writing prayers and reflections. I flipped through it and found multiple entries about me and his frustration with my continued PTSD symptoms. One entry from 2 months ago said, "Lord, I don't understand why Vanessa won't let go of what happened with Derek. I've tried to be patient, but it's affecting our intimacy and our marriage. Please show me how to lead her to true forgiveness so we can move forward. Maybe I need to reach out to Derek directly and get his perspective on what really happened that night. Help me have the courage to do what's necessary for my wife's healing, even if she doesn't understand it." Reading that entry made me realize Nathan had actually convinced himself he was doing something noble by contacting Derek. He'd framed it as spiritual leadership and concern for my well-being rather than the violation it actually was. This was somehow worse than if he'd been malicious, because it meant he was so trapped in his religious framework that he couldn't see how twisted his logic had become. I took photos of the journal entries and added them to my evidence file. Then I put everything back exactly as I'd found it and waited for Nathan to come home from church. When he arrived, he was in a good mood, talking about how the worship music had been particularly moving and how he'd felt God's presence during prayer time. I nodded along while internally counting down the days until he'd be served with divorce papers and his carefully constructed world would implode. Monday morning, I went to Stephanie's office and reviewed the divorce paperwork. Everything was exactly as we'd discussed. Divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty, equitable division of assets. No request for spousal support from either party. Stephanie had included detailed descriptions of Nathan's communications with Derek as evidence of the extreme cruelty, and reading it all laid out in legal language made the reality of what was happening hit me again. I was ending my marriage. I was legally declaring that the man I'd chosen to spend my life with had betrayed me so fundamentally that the relationship couldn't be salvaged. I signed all the documents with a shaking hand, and Stephanie said the process server would deliver them to Nathan at his workplace on Thursday afternoon. She advised me to be packed and ready to leave as soon as I got confirmation that he'd been served because his reaction might be volatile. I spent the next 3 days preparing to leave. I arranged for a moving company to put our shared furniture in storage until the divorce was finalized and we could divide it. I transferred more money from our joint account, taking what I was entitled to and leaving Nathan's portion. I packed up everything I wanted to take with me immediately and loaded it into my car. I told my boss I needed to work remotely from New York indefinitely due to a family situation, and she approved it without asking too many questions. I called Adrienne and told her I'd be arriving Thursday night and would explain everything when I got there. She said she'd have her guest room ready and had already stocked her refrigerator with wine and ice cream. I felt simultaneously grateful for her support and devastated that I needed it. I'd thought Nathan was going to be my person, my safe space, my forever. Instead, he'd turned out to be another man who thought his version of reality was more important than mine. Thursday morning, I kissed Nathan goodbye before he left for work, knowing it would be the last time I'd see him as my husband. He seemed completely oblivious to what was about to happen, chatting about dinner plans and whether we should go to the church potluck on Saturday. I told him I'd let him know and watched him drive away. Then I finished loading the last of my things into my car and waited for Stephanie's text confirming that Nathan had been served. The message came through at 2:37 p.m. Process server confirms delivery. Client was shocked but accepted papers without incident. You're clear to leave. I got in my car and started driving toward New York, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My phone started ringing before I'd even reached the highway. Nathan's name flashed on the screen again and again. I let every call go to voicemail. After the fifth call, I pulled over at a rest stop and listened to the voicemails. The first three were Nathan demanding to know where I was and what the hell I was thinking filing for divorce without even talking to him. His voice was angry but controlled, still trying to maintain the moral high ground. The fourth message was different, his voice breaking as he said, "Vanessa, please call me back. We need to talk about this. I know you're upset, but divorce isn't the answer. We can work through this together with counseling and prayer. Please don't throw away our marriage without giving me a chance to explain." The fifth message was him saying he'd contacted Pastor Keith and they wanted to schedule an emergency meeting with both of us to discuss reconciliation. I deleted all the voicemails without responding and got back on the road. There was nothing Nathan could say that would make any of this okay. No explanation that would justify what he'd done. He'd had weeks to tell me he'd been in contact with Derek. He'd had years to actually support my healing instead of undermining it. He didn't get to play the victim now that he'd been caught. I don't know. My phone rang again, and this time it was a number I didn't recognize. I answered it without thinking, and Derek Paulson's voice came through the speaker saying, "Vanessa, this is Derek. Nathan called me upset about the divorce, and I thought maybe I should reach out. I know we have a complicated history, but I really think we should talk about what happened between us. I've done a lot of work on myself over the years, and I'd like a chance to apologize properly if you'd be willing to hear it." The sound of his voice after 7 years of silence made panic slam into my chest. I pulled over again, my vision tunneling and my breath coming in short gasps. Derek kept talking, saying something about healing and closure, but I couldn't process the words over the roaring in my ears. I managed to hang up the phone and sat there in my parked car, having a full-blown panic attack while traffic rushed by on the highway beside me. It took 20 minutes before I could breathe normally again. I called Dr. Chen's emergency line, and she talked me through grounding exercises until I felt stable enough to drive. Then she said something that made everything click into focus. "Vanessa, Derek calling you directly is harassment. Nathan giving him your phone number is a violation of your privacy and potentially criminal depending on your state's laws. You need to document this immediately and report it to both your attorney and the police." She was right. Nathan hadn't just betrayed me by talking to Derek. He'd given Derek access to me again. He'd opened a door I'd spent 7 years keeping closed. I called Stephanie from the rest stop and told her what had happened. She was furious on my behalf and said, "This changes things. We're filing for a protective order against both Nathan and Derek on Monday morning, and I'm adding this to the divorce filing as additional evidence of extreme cruelty. Nathan has now actively facilitated your harasser contacting you directly. That's beyond betrayal. That's endangerment." I made it to Adrienne's apartment in New York around 9 that night, emotionally exhausted and running on adrenaline. She took one look at me and pulled me into a hug, letting me cry on her shoulder in the hallway outside her apartment while her neighbors pretended not to notice. Inside, she'd set up her guest room with fresh sheets and flowers and a care package of all my favorite things. We stayed up until almost 3 in the morning while I told her everything that had happened since Thursday afternoon. Adrienne was ready to drive back to my city and slash Nathan's tires, but I talked her down by reminding her that revenge would feel good for 5 minutes and then complicate my legal case. She made me promise to let Stephanie handle everything through official channels. I promised, even though part of me wanted to do something dramatic and destructive to match how I felt inside. Over the weekend, Nathan called and texted constantly. His messages evolved from angry to pleading to manipulative, cycling through every emotional register he thought might work. He said I was overreacting and being vindictive. He said he'd only contacted Derek because he cared about my healing and wanted to understand what had really happened. He said I was letting the enemy destroy our marriage instead of fighting for it. He said Pastor Keith wanted to talk to me about biblical principles of reconciliation. He said if I went through with the divorce, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. He said he loved me and couldn't understand why I was being so cruel. Not once did he actually acknowledge that what he'd done was wrong. Not once did he apologize for betraying my trust or giving Derek my phone number. Every message was about managing me, manipulating me, trying to regain control of a narrative that had slipped away from him. Derek called twice more over the weekend from different numbers. I didn't answer either call but listened to the voicemails he left. Both messages were superficially apologetic, but contained subtle implications that I shared responsibility for what had happened between us. He talked about miscommunication and misunderstanding, about how young they'd both been, about how he'd grown and changed. The subtext was clear. He wanted me to absolve him so he could stop carrying whatever minimal guilt he felt about raping me. I saved all the voicemails and forwarded them to Stephanie as evidence. Then I blocked every number I could identify as belonging to either Nathan or Derek, though I knew they could always call from other phones if they were determined enough. Adrian suggested I change my number entirely, and I decided to do exactly that as soon as possible. I needed to cut off their access to me completely. Monday morning, Stephanie filed for protective orders against both Nathan and Derek. The petitions detailed Nathan's betrayal and Derek's subsequent harassment, including transcripts of his voicemail messages. The judge reviewed the evidence and granted temporary orders valid for 30 days, with a full hearing scheduled for 3 weeks out where both Nathan and Derek would have a chance to contest the orders. Under the temporary orders, neither of them could contact me directly or through third parties, and they had to stay at least 500 feet away from me at all times. Stephanie said the orders would be served to both men by end of day, and she warned me they might react badly to being legally restrained. She advised me to stay in New York and avoid going back to my city until after the full hearing. I told her that was fine because I had no intention of going back there anytime soon anyway. That evening, I got an email from Pastor Keith Drummond at Nathan's church. He'd somehow gotten my email address, probably from Nathan, and wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss the divorce and my accusations against Nathan. He wrote that he'd known Nathan for 5 years and found it hard to believe he'd do something as malicious as I was claiming, and that perhaps I was misinterpreting Nathan's attempts to help me heal. The email was professionally worded but dripped with condescension, and the assumption that I was either lying or too damaged to understand what had really happened. I forwarded the email to Stephanie without responding, and she said she'd send Pastor Keith a cease and desist letter, making clear that any further contact with me would be considered harassment. She also said the email would be useful evidence in the divorce case, showing the kind of environment Nathan had been cultivating around our marriage. Over the next 2 weeks, I started rebuilding my life from New York. I found a therapist who specialized in complex trauma and religious abuse, and started seeing her twice a week. I set up my remote workstation in Adrian's dining room and fell back into a routine with my job. I changed my phone number and only gave the new one to people I trusted completely. I started sleeping through the night without nightmares for the first time in months, and I realized how much stress Nathan had been adding to my PTSD symptoms with his constant pressure and manipulation. Without him in my daily life, I could finally breathe. Adrian and I fell into an easy roommate rhythm, cooking dinners together and watching bad reality TV and having the kind of honest conversations I hadn't been able to have with anyone in years. She never judged me for marrying Nathan or for not seeing the warning signs sooner. She just supported me in moving forward. The protective order hearing happened 3 weeks after the temporary orders were granted. I appeared via video conference from Stephanie's office in my city, where I'd returned just for the hearing. Nathan appeared in person with his own attorney, a man from his church who did family law part-time. Derek appeared separately with a public defender. The judge reviewed all the evidence: the Facebook messages, the emails to Pastor Keith, the phone records, Derek's voicemail messages, everything. Nathan's attorney tried to argue that his client had been trying to help his wife heal and had acted out of love rather than malice. Stephanie demolished that argument by walking through the timeline of Nathan's communications with Derek and highlighting how he'd shared private medical information and given Derek access to contact me directly. The judge listened to everything and then made his ruling. Protective orders granted for 1 year, renewable if necessary, with violations carrying criminal penalties. Nathan looked shell-shocked as the judge explained the terms. Derek looked angry and started to say something, but his public defender shut him down quickly. As I watched them both via video conference, I felt something shift inside me. These two men who'd hurt me so profoundly had wanted me to spend my life carrying their damage, blaming myself, making myself smaller to accommodate their egos and their narratives. But I was done with that. I was done letting them define my reality or my worth. The judge's ruling had given me legal protection, but I'd already given myself something more important: permission to trust my own experience and protect my own boundaries without apology. When the hearing ended and everyone disconnected from the video call, I sat in Stephanie's office and cried with relief. Not because the legal system had validated me, though that helped, but because I'd finally, completely validated myself. The divorce was finalized 3 months later without Nathan contesting it. He'd apparently been advised by his attorney that fighting would only make the evidence of his betrayal more public, and he'd decided to take the settlement rather than drag things out. I got the house and my car and half of everything we'd built together, which wasn't much since we'd only been married 2 years. The real victory was getting my freedom back and knowing I'd never have to perform the role of submissive Christian wife for someone who'd weaponized my trauma against me. I stayed in New York and officially moved in with Adrienne, turning her guest room into my permanent bedroom. My job approved the permanent remote work arrangement, and I never had to go back to my old city except to meet with Stephanie and handle final paperwork. I filed a formal complaint against Derek with the police about his harassment, and while no criminal charges came from it, having an official report felt like another piece of reclaiming my narrative. 6 months after the divorce, I got an email from Bethany, a woman I didn't know. She explained that she'd been dating Derek until recently, when she'd discovered he'd raped someone years ago. She'd done some research and found my name connected to his through court records from my original police report. She wanted to apologize for not believing Derek's accusers sooner and to warn me that he'd been telling people I'd gotten a protective order against him because I was still obsessed with him years later. She said she'd made the mistake of believing his version of events until she'd seen text messages on his phone where he and Nathan had mocked my PTSD symptoms and joked about me being damaged goods. The messages had made her sick, she said, and she'd broken up with Derek immediately. She wanted me to know that she believed me and she was sorry for whatever role she'd played in giving Derek credibility by dating him. I wrote back thanking her for reaching out and warning her to be careful because men like Derek didn't like being rejected. 2 weeks later, she got a protective order against him too after he'd started showing up at her work and sending threatening messages. I testified in Bethany's protective order hearing via video conference, explaining Derek's pattern of harassment and his relationship with my ex-husband. The judge was the same one who'd granted my order, and he clearly remembered the case. He granted Bethany's protective order for 2 years and made a note in Derek's file about his escalating behavior. Afterward, Bethany and I started emailing regularly, both of us processing what it meant to have been targeted by the same predator and betrayed by men who'd claimed to care about us. She told me Derek had met Nathan through a men's group at Nathan's church, which explained how Nathan had initially found him. The church connection made everything make even more sense. Nathan had been cultivating relationships with other men who shared his views about women and forgiveness and biblical authority. Derek had fit perfectly into that worldview as someone who'd been falsely accused by a vindictive woman who couldn't let go of the past. A year after I'd left Nathan, I ran into him accidentally at a coffee shop in my old city, where I'd gone to meet with Stephanie about finalizing some paperwork. He was with a woman I didn't recognize, someone young and pretty who laughed at something he said. He saw me at the same moment I saw him, and his expression cycled through surprise and guilt and defensiveness before settling on careful neutrality. The woman with him looked between us curiously, clearly sensing tension, but not understanding it. Nathan nodded at me stiffly, and I nodded back, both of us acknowledging the other's existence without engaging. As I walked past them to leave, I heard the woman ask him, "Who was that?" And Nathan's response, "Nobody important, just someone I used to know." The casual erasure of our entire relationship and everything he'd done to me should have hurt, but instead I felt grateful. If I was nobody important to him, then he had no power over me anymore. I moved back to my city eventually, buying my own small condo and starting fresh in a space that had never contained Nathan or his judgment or his betrayal. I kept seeing my trauma therapist, and slowly, gradually, the nightmares became less frequent. I started dating again, taking it slow and being honest about my history from the start. Some people couldn't handle it, and that was fine. I'd learned to see that as them filtering themselves out rather than me being rejected. I connected with a local support group for sexual assault survivors and started volunteering as a peer counselor, helping other women navigate the aftermath of trauma and betrayal. Sharing my story and watching it help others heal gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't expected. What Nathan and Derek had meant for harm had somehow transformed into something I could use to help prevent harm to others. 3 years after everything fell apart, I got a message through the support group's website from a woman named Jennifer. She'd been married to Nathan for 6 months and had recently discovered he'd been in contact with her abusive ex-husband, sharing details about her trauma and suggesting ways the ex could reach out to make amends. She'd found my name through Nathan's old Facebook messages that he'd apparently never deleted, and she wanted to know if what she'd read was real. I met Jennifer for coffee and told her everything, showing her copies of all the evidence I still had saved. She cried and thanked me for validating her reality, saying Nathan had been telling her she was being paranoid and oversensitive for questioning his judgment. She filed for divorce a week later. I helped her find an attorney and walked her through the process I'd been through. Watching her escape gave me a satisfaction that felt like justice, finally catching up to Nathan's pattern of abuse. Nathan's new wife wasn't the last woman to contact me. Over the years, 3 more reached out, all of them having discovered Nathan's pattern of allying with their abusers and undermining their healing. Each time, I shared my documentation and my experience, helping them see clearly what was happening so they could make informed choices. Some of them left immediately like Jennifer had. Others stayed longer, trying to fix things before finally accepting that Nathan's behavior was a feature rather than a bug. Every woman who contacted me was evidence that I'd been right to document everything and right to leave when I did. If I'd stayed and tried to work it out like Nathan and Pastor Keith had wanted, I'd have just been enabling his abuse to continue and spread to other victims. By leaving and speaking publicly about what he'd done, I'd created a paper trail that helped protect other women when they encountered him. 5 years after my divorce, I testified before a state legislative committee about the need for stronger laws protecting victims of domestic violence and harassment. I talked about how Nathan had shared my private medical information with my rapist, and how Derek had used that information to contact and harass me. I explained how the protective orders had been essential for my safety, but had taken weeks to obtain, during which time I'd been vulnerable to escalating harassment. My testimony helped pass a bill that strengthened privacy protections for domestic violence victims and expedited the protective order process. Standing in that committee room telling my story to lawmakers and advocates, I felt the final piece of my healing click into place. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was using what had happened to me to make the world slightly safer for other women in similar situations. I never heard from Nathan or Derek again after the protective orders expired, though I occasionally saw updates about them through mutual connections. Nathan had moved to a different state and was apparently still involved in conservative evangelical churches, still presenting himself as a godly man and spiritual leader. Derek had been arrested for assault on a different woman but had gotten a plea deal for a lesser charge. Neither of them had faced real consequences for what they'd done to me beyond the protective orders and the divorce. But I'd learned that justice didn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looked like rebuilding your life into something they couldn't touch. Sometimes it looked like helping other women escape before the damage got as deep as yours had. Sometimes it looked like standing in front of legislators and saying, "This happened to me, and here's how we prevent it from happening to anyone else." That was the justice I'd created for myself, and it turned out to be exactly enough. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now, and let me know your take in the comments.